It's morning for me. I don't believe it is morning for Tyler. So I know for a fact it's not morning where you are. Let me rephrase that. So I'm here with Rasa Office Hours with Tyler Dunn, who's a product manager. Um, and do you want to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about what it is that you do at Rasa?
Yeah, for sure. Yes. First and foremost, thanks for having me, Rachel. It's awesome
Of course.
to talk to the
It's
community.
morning for me. I don't believe it
Usually,
is
if
morning
you're
for
talking to me,
Tyler.
it's more in a one-on-one
So,
fashion versus this kind of broadcast. And I think that's for me where my job starts as the product manager, a product manager at Raza, is talking to people in the community, finding out what problems are you facing, what feedback you have, what features do you want to see, specifically that I guess from my perspective allow you to either build or deploy an assistant to production that's hopefully better and easier to build, right? And so that's across both Rasa open source as well as Rasa X and Rasa Enterprise. So on the day to day, after I'm done talking to community and customer users, then I spend a lot of time with engineers and designers, also the go to market teams, like Rachel, for example, giving feedback that are related to product and ensuring that we have some level of alignment over where we are with product and where Ty or Tyler works.
a very connected role. Works on with a lot of different things. And I'm just sort of curious while starting to wait for questions to come in on the chat. What feature that you have added or maybe removed from Rasa, open source or Rasa X, are you the most proud of?
Mm,
Obviously a team effort, but like if you had to pick one.
definitely. I feel like it's definitely got to be integrated version control.
Mm.
So if you're not familiar, it's the part of ROS X, ROS Enterprise that allows you to connect our platform to any remote Git repository, whether it be on Bitbucket, GitLab, GitHub, or any of the code hosting Git platforms. And it has a two-way sync so that any changes you make in GitHub or GitLab are reflected in ROS X and vice versa. And it's just been transformative, I would say, in terms of the ability for teams, especially, to use Rasa X because you can be in the command line, kind of updating, editing your assistant, and then other people can kind of be annotating in Rasa X. And then because we built on top of Git, we got a lot of things kind of extra that maybe you wouldn't say are features of our product, but I might consider them to be because they're pretty open technologies like Git for like versioning, and then in addition to that, kind of the ecosystem that's built around it. So CI/CD platforms like Jenkins and GitHub Actions and stuff like that, as well as just the general knowledge, right, of not having to reinvent the wheel, right, not having to like do conflict resolution inside the platform and spend a lot of time working with designers and engineers and being the intermediate of translating that. And to kind of find a very simple vast majority of our team was
Yeah, definitely something it would be hard to use a modern software product that did not have. That was a weird sentence. Um, and we have a question from Anupam.
okay.
My bot has a form which has 3 slots: username, age, and location. After filling these slots, I ask for user confirmation if the given information is correct or not. In the case of incorrect data, let's say a user has misspelled his or her name or their name, and now I want to ask them to enter a correct name, keeping the other slots the same. How to do that? And I do have a quick question for you, Anupam. Is this a Rasa 1.x or 2.x assistant? Actually, I guess that doesn't matter for the specific thing I'm going to say. What would you say, Tyler?
Let me look at. I'm trying to keep up. So, okay, maybe best to first understand what they're describing. So, if I understood correctly, they have a form, three different slots: name,
Mm-hmm.
age, and location. And then afterwards, they confirm if the
Mm-hmm.
information is correct or not. In the case of incorrect, they like a misspelled name. They want to ask to enter the correct name for other slots. How do you do that?
Yeah, and it is 2.0.
2.0. Okay. And so I guess personally, obviously probably start in the docs, and I would go to,
I've got them here.
awesome. The way I'd go about it is I would go to obviously Rasa open source, and then I would probably start with forms, personally.
That's not how you spell forms. Is there a specific place you're looking for?
Yeah, I guess my knowledge of exactly how forms work in 2.0 isn't as good as it should be, and so I guess I would start there versus like kind of right where we're about to click validating form input and kind of see I know I guess at a high level with 2.0 we've moved forms from the SDK to potentially within the kind of YAML files, and so first I want to make sure, is there something that we support within just not having to use a custom action, and make sure that we take advantage of that. And then if not, then I know we should go to the custom action. Handle this case.
Yeah. I would say custom action is probably going to be the easiest way that I would do it. I would do it as like part of the validation action, or maybe a separate action. I'd probably call it like confirmation validation.
Okay.
And I guess the other thing that you could do, I haven't done this, but it seems feasible, would be to write a rule so that you had like another slot that was, name validated, age validated, location validated, and then after your form you trigger this rule where when those slots aren't validated you ask. I don't know. I think a custom action is probably going to be the easiest way, but it feels like something you could do with rules.
Definitely. The question I would have, and I'm curious if you have an answer to this, could you make it like a rule that would be something you could apply on top of all potential forms or multiple potential? Or do you think it would have to be a rule like specific to each form that you'd want to do it for?
That's a good question. I think you'd probably be able to have something that happens well, because a rule could trigger an action. So I might use a rule to trigger the action after the form. Yeah. My gut instinct says using a custom action and maybe rules. We have a question. I hope that helps, Anupam. I have not actually done this previously. Mia says, "Hi, Rachel and Tyler, sorry. Recently, I wrote a script to integrate a BERT NER model. So BERT, big transformer language model, NER, named entity recognition. It shows every entity in the backend terminal, but does not show in the Rasa X UI. Can you please tell me why this is?"
I guess the question, the part that sticks out to me is a script to integrate for NER model. Are you using it as like a custom component? I'm guessing that would be the way to go about it, but I want to make sure, because if that's not the case, then I think it would be tough.
Yeah, because Rasa X is, the benefit of I'm sure you could talk to this in more detail than I could, Tyler, but the benefit of a really nice UX is that, your whole team can be on it, they can be working together. The downside is it's a little bit less flexible than just working with code. That's all I had to say there.
Yeah.
So we're waiting for Mia. Mia says yes, so a custom component.
Okay. And so I guess the question would then be, for me, like, how does that custom component actually then expose the entity? Like, is it being put into the conversation events? Because the way that Rasa X is set up, it will kind of pull from that event stream and expects intents and entities to be captured in a very specific way. And then the UI will then highlight the entities and expose it. But if that event stream and also I guess depends on how you're serving your model as well. But if that event stream doesn't have the conversation event stream doesn't have the entities, or the tracker doesn't have the entities picked up, then they won't be properly kind of exposed in the UI.
Yeah, so it could be, sounds like maybe a format expectation mismatch.
Yep,
Possibly.
my guess. I'd also be very curious to hear about how well the BERT named entity recognition model works. Maybe even something, if you're willing to share with the research team, they're always on the lookout to see what the community is using, especially these large language models, for how well they're working or not.
Yeah, definitely. What would be the best way for somebody to get in contact with the research team?
Good question. I don't know if do they have a team email? So I guess
I don't know.
I could say that at least for now, while I'm on here, the t.dunn@rasa.com, my email for Tyler, the first word T, and then dot, and then my last name DUNN@rasa.com. You send an email there, at least today while you're listening on their live stream, and I have the context of why you're emailing me because I just recommended it. Happy to figure that out and have a better answer the next time I come on.
I think it could be useful for folks.
Definitely.
Right. Mia says, I'll look into it. Thank you for your answer. Yeah. Droid City says, I have a doubt regarding Slack and Telegram Python code. Can you provide an overview or a use case for how they work? I will say I have used neither of these platforms. I'm a little bit more familiar with the Slack API because I've read some of their docs, but also that was like 2 years ago. And I imagine they've changed since then. So let's see, I bet we have some here.
I've actually used both, which is exciting.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so Slack, I think the important thing to get right is actually not in the Python code, but in the permissions. Like they have a UI that you actually have to go through to kind of get your Slack token and your signing secret. And so I feel like that's usually the hard part because they have so many different levels of permissions. And so you have to make sure, I don't know off the top of my head which ones, but you have to make sure to get those right. And then it's a matter of kind of copying over the channel ID and the Slack token. All of that.
And the other one was Telegram. Is that in our docs?
Yep. The Telegram is actually, I would say, one of the easier ones to go about it. They kind of as a platform, I think, are very friendly to bots. And so like the way it works is pretty straightforward. It doesn't have like the permissions kind of aspect to it. As you can see, I think it's 4 steps. It's mostly getting that access token, making sure that you can write, post, and port for the webhook, and then adding those to your credentials.yaml and kind of following the bot father process, I think is what they call it. Way of actually kind of verifying it, and then almost anybody can then message your bot after that on the Telegram.
So I would, the way I found this was that I went to the Rasa docs and then I'm using Control K to search. I don't remember exactly where in the tree everything is. So hopefully that helped Droid City. Droid City says, Discord and Slack have the same sections, so I try to work with them. That helped. Sridhar says, sorry if I'm saying that wrong, if I deploy Rasa X on K8s, will it support 2 chatbots?
Oh, I think this one's tailored for me. I know a lot about Rasa X. I've been working especially on it a lot lately. So I love the one-line deployment script. Actually deploys a K8 stands for Kubernetes deployment. And then there's also kind of an open source Helm chart that allows you to also deploy a Kubernetes K8 deployment. So both options, yeah, in the Rasa X docs to get started are great. Definitely the using the first one in terms of the quick compilation, I think is what we call it now. It's fast, quick, easy, and then the Helm chart is a little bit more scalable. But to get to the original question about can you support multiple today, no. It's generally 1 chatbot per Rasa X instance or Rasa Enterprise instance. Definitely something on the roadmap, but we hear it from from people once they're successful with their first assistant, they want another one, and
Oh,
not be able to have to like do a whole other Kubernetes heavy Helm chart deployment is hard. And so today, like if you use integrated version control, like we were talking about at the beginning, you can only sync between one assistant and another. And then if you're kind of receiving messages, as far as I'm aware, you can't do multiple event brokers into Crossx, which you probably wouldn't want to anyways, because if you only have one assistant that you can annotate for, it'd be a bit weird to be getting conversations from another. But I can tell you it is definitely on the roadmap.
so to answer your question, no, not yet. And I will say we are having this conversation December 2nd, 2020. So if you're watching it far in the future, the answer may be different. Mia has a link to the NER BERT model, which I haven't pulled up. It is for bin. There we go. So if that is helpful for folks. Also, always delighted to see people working in language other than English. Like I like English, obviously the language I speak, but it gets all the work, and it's not fair. And then Mia wants to know if I can contact through LinkedIn. For me, you can try. I'm almost never on LinkedIn, and I have an enormous backlog of stuff, so I wouldn't recommend it. I can't speak for Tyler.
Yeah, I have probably less of a backlog than Rachel, but I also have a tendency to not just, I don't know, it's the weird philosophy, right? Do you accept everything that people, because especially in the Rasa community or not? And so I usually like to say at least I have to have one conversation with someone. That way I at least have some level of ability
Context.
to know a little bit more about them than just on the screen. But that said, I don't get that many messages on LinkedIn, so if you do message me on LinkedIn, I probably will. And then we can have that one conversation. We can definitely be connected.
I think that's a very reasonable stance. George says, "Hi George, hi Rachel and Tyler. Short question on NLP research. Which of the NLP-oriented frameworks do you prefer? I'm thinking on Allen NLP, OpenMT, Flare, PyText. And do you use TensorFlow or PyTorch?"
I think the second part's a bit easier for me, so I can jump on that one.
Yeah.
The Rasa team uses TensorFlow, at least from my understanding of NLP in general. TensorFlow tends to be, at least historically, it's not that long, but in the last like 5 years, whatever, since it's existed, more used in industry, like for production use cases. However, PyTorch, from what I understand, tends to be more like the dominant in the research space, with some people moving more towards PyTorch in industry, I would say, is my general, I mean, very outsider perspective, just be more just being a someone who, for fun, who watches the NLP Twitter and keeps up with, I mean, so newsletters and reads papers from time to time, make myself feel like a researcher. But yeah, that's my understanding of that. And then in the first part, I've come across, I mean, all of them, but I don't actually use them on a day-to-day, so I don't want to comment.
Yeah, I think probably the NLP framework that I use most often is Spacey, which I realize is a little bit higher level than the ones that you're talking about. But I really like it, very usable. That's my preference. PR says, do you have an OSS Slack channel or Slack channel? I'm assuming it's supposed to be Slack. We do have a Slack channel for people who are contributing to Rasa. So if you make a contribution to Rasa open source, that's something. I don't know if we have something else.
Yeah, I'd say other than that, right, the forum is kind of where people hang out and ask questions. If you don't want to contribute to the open source. Also point out, I'm sure Rachel talks about it, but it doesn't have to necessarily be a code contribution. Either be a contributor and to join that Slack, you could write some articles or go on a meetup or any number of things. I think it's outlined in our contributor program. I'm not sure the best link to find that. I think it's actually at the top of it. Highly recommend doing that. And I mean, I especially am always on that Slack. I feel like I'm giving reactions every time some people say things. So exciting to see everyone contributing.
We have a number of ways to contribute.
This is the problem with Rasa getting so big. I think we're almost to like 70 or 80 people. It's like the website changes and things change, and it's so hard to keep up.
George says, I'm new to NLP research, so George was asking about the frameworks. And I'm deciding on the tools to use. I'm sure the decision of how to write my code now will chase me for years. By the way, I prefer Tensorflow, and I'm trying to do everything there. So, I mean, I guess my first question is, do you want to work at Google? Because in my experience, I mean, that's where TensorFlow is from. A lot of the work from there tends to be working in TensorFlow. In general, PyTorch is a little bit higher level. I find that people who are new in the space tend to prefer it because it's a little bit harder to, it is easier to get started and there's less futzing. But if you're working on, sort of new architectures and algorithm design, TensorFlow has more fine-grained control. I would say that's sort of the big difference. I think PyTorch is a little bit more popular now on TensorFlow, at least like with students. There's nothing wrong with either of them, right? It's just like, which one do you prefer? And I will say I almost never use raw TensorFlow. If I am going to use TensorFlow, I'll usually go through Keras because, again, I like high-level languages. I don't. I'm too impatient to futz around with super low-level stuff these days. Yeah. George says, what about sklearn? Who doesn't use sklearn? If anyone's not familiar, sklearn is a Python library that has a bunch of utility functions for machine learning and is everyone uses it. Everyone should use it if they're using Python. The other option is R, which does also have a TensorFlow API. All right. And Tudor was asking about the OSS channel. And then to pick back up with Droid City, who was asking about the various channels, Discord and Slack can have the same section, so I can try to work with them in the back end. Python code that makes this work for Slack and Telegram. Oh, so it sounds like you're talking about building a connector for multiple things? I'm interpreting that correct? Like one connector that will hit both Slack and Discord and Telegram?
Yeah, I'm curious to hear the response to that question, but things that stick out to me would be one, like you can actually use multiple channels with Rasa natively, so maybe question the need for something like that. And then I guess if you still want to, or that we just don't understand the full kind of reasoning behind it, I really recommend going to github.com/rasahq/rasa. Then I believe it's either channels or connectors will be the folder name, and you can actually see all of them. And so you can actually see the code that we use, at least natively, in Rasa open source to connect to Telegram and to connect to forgot the other one, Slack. And so you should be able to use that as inspiration if you do want to set up some kind of connector.
There you go. That's the nice thing about being open source. You can just look at our code. It's out there. And a really good question from Amber, AQIB. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Can you please help explain Rasa? I'm new to this channel. Tyler, what's Rasa?
Wow. What is Rasa? It's a good question. I guess first and foremost, Rasa is the company behind Rasa open source, Rasa X, and Rasa Enterprise. Our mission is to build the standard infrastructure layer for conversational interfaces. And so kind of our vision for the future is that in the same way that you interact with technology via graphical user interfaces, where you can see a screen and like click on different things, but you'll also be able to interact with, maybe not in all instances, but many instances with your voice or with text, natural language. So exactly how you describe a problem, how you talk about it, how you think about it is hopefully in the longer run going to be understood by the software systems, which I think enables a lot of people to intuitively and naturally and without having to learn a complex UI interact with that technology. Open source, meaning it's free and has a license to it that allows you to use it for whatever you want. And so that's kind of the what I would call the infrastructure layer, that standard infrastructure we're trying to build. And then we have some tools on top of it that maybe make the process of building a little bit easier, faster, allow you to build a better system.
I would maybe even put it in a dumber way and say that if you would like to build a chatbot, we provide the software for you to do that, both to do the machine learning in a really sort of cutting edge way, because we have a research team that's working on stuff, and we have a, I don't want to say like completely unique way of approaching conversational AI and sort of like stuff under the hood, but I don't know of anyone else who's doing it the way that we're doing it. And once you've built it, obviously you want people to use it and make it better, and we have a wonderful UI that helps with that workflow. End of end of spiel. And I think I actually mixed a question. Arjun says, how to make a multilingual bot in Rasa, please explain. I actually have a YouTube video talks about this. Let me really quickly see if I can pull that up. And while I'm doing that, Goldie wants to know how to use the GPU to train the Rasa for model building.
Good question. I've actually heard this one a couple of times and I haven't looked it up. From what I understand, it should be if you have a GPU. I guess I don't know. Maybe I'm getting out of my depth here, but I'm fairly certain you don't have to necessarily do anything special. Could be wrong about that.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think you can just. I also have not messed around with hardware much. I also say I haven't really trained an assistant that's big enough that it's particularly slow to train.
Yeah.
We try to be as lightweight as possible. And also here is the video on building multilingual NLP. It's called NLP for Developers, multilingual NLP. And anything that I'd say now, I say in that video with like nice slides to help. So I would recommend checking that out.
While we were doing that, I actually searched the docs and I found something that is a hint. So maybe you could you try searching configuring TensorFlow?
Absolutely. Oh yeah, there's a config file, isn't there?
Yeah, so it looks like you can configure options for the TensorFlow runtime environment, and then in there you can actually optimize GPU performance. And then in this docs that Rachel pulled up, you can actually see how to do that.
So I just searched in the Rasa open source docs for configuring TensorFlow. There we go. Yeah, that's the answer. Thank you, Tyler.
Of course.
Okay. Ryan says da da da, and then Droid says yes, like for Discord. So Droid City is the one who was asking about the multiple channels, like Discord. Okay, so I'm guessing you're asking about a Discord channel connector because we don't have it in the docs. I would say you probably want to write a custom connector. I don't know if Discord has a REST endpoint. Let's see. I'm just Googling Discord REST in another window. Yeah, Discord's got a REST API. Yep, so you would treat it like you could use one of our examples. Facebook as REST, right?
I think so.
So you could use the Facebook Messenger example code, and the Discord API reference to check that out. This also feels like something that somebody would have already built and open sourced. This feels like something a community member has probably already done. Let's see if I can find something on GitHub. I know Vincent was talking about working on a Discord bot for a personal project. Discord Rasa. I don't know if he actually did it.
And for some reason there isn't one, or there isn't one in our official open source repo. I'd love to see that as a contribution.
Definitely.
I'm surprised that there isn't one already.
And I did find an example by Dengir on GitHub. I'm just looking to see if I can see the license. It looks like it doesn't have a license, so you may need to not just straight up use the code, or contact this GitHub user and ask for a license. But yes, definitely possible.
And if you follow through, highly recommend making an open source contribution since you're going to do the work already. It'd be really cool for everyone in the community to be able to take advantage of it.
Definitely, and we would love to send you some swag. George says, if in production you have TensorFlow and in research PyTorch, you have to have a ninja translating that code to deploy to production, no? I feel like there's probably utilities to convert between the two. I feel like, oh, I just realized that your name is very uncentered. Zach, let me over. I would say generally, try to stick with whatever it is that your team is using. My general advice.
For example, like at Rasa, our research team uses TensorFlow, which is also what we use in Rasa open source. By no means does no one do research in TensorFlow.
Oh, no, not at all.
Like a lot of people do. So.
Yes, it is very common as a research language. Kip says, does Rasa have algorithms, like machine learning, to train NLP models, or is it more drag and drop type, like the code is already written for you, and you can use it like an API? That's a great question. I'm gonna bat that over to Tyler, the badminton bat.
Yeah, there's lots of, when I see this, there's lots of dimensions to it. I would say first and foremost, we do have algorithms that use machine learning. And I would say, I wouldn't necessarily say they train NLP models, like we're very focused on specifically conversational interfaces. And so the two kind of models that we do train are natural language understanding, NLU, and so a model that can do intent classification and entity extraction. And more specific, usually within the context of a conversation. So often like the messages are much shorter. Like I've seen people try to take that and use it, say, for like on emails, which I've seen very limited success on that. So I'd probably say it's very optimized for shorter messages that you would see in a conversation. And then the other kind of model is a dialogue management model. And so it's actually kind of a hybrid. It's not pure machine learning to actually figure out what next action the assistant should take, how to manage that dialogue. Instead, it uses a combination of rules, kind of a rule-based system, and memorizing kind of example conversations. We call them stories. And then also, like if neither of those kind of work out, then a machine learning policy can kind of kick in and try and, I always call it like an insurance policy to like try and figure out, okay, can we save this? Even though we didn't anticipate it, can we potentially save this? And so we don't offer any kind of drag and drop on top of Rasa today. There are some kind of, I would say, tools in the ecosystem that people are kind of trying to, but our kind of vision for the future, like where we think things are going, is that conversational interfaces are software and that it's best to build them and approach them like software. And so something like a no-code solution, right? Like I think is definitely, maybe not definitely, but is a potentiality kind of longer term, but kind of similar to in the 1990s when people were trying to build more drag and drop to build websites. Like a lot of those ended up getting kind of replaced, or at least in the near term, augmented by kind of open source technologies and things that offered abstractions that could be improved a little bit faster and gave you a little bit more power. I think that's kind of in the near term where we want to go, but maybe in the longer term, something like a no-code revolution that came to kind of more web apps would actually come to conversational interface. That said, we do offer like Rasa X, which is a UI that helps you kind of do a lot of the important tasks, like annotate certain training data, review conversations, add tests and things like that. And so it's not that we don't think everything should be done in code, right? I think it's a real balance, right? It's one of my core kind of tensions I'm always trying to figure out is like, where does it make sense to expose things only to developers who would use it versus kind of the other people in conversational teams, like conversational designers and product owners and content owners, business users, and stuff like that. And we're constantly working with customers and people in the community to figure that out. Sorry for a long answer. I guess to shorten it in case I lost you for a second. We do use machine learning to train conversational AI specific NLP models, and we don't really offer a drag and drop for like say dialogue management, but there is a UI that you can use for many of the components of building Rasa.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd say in terms of developer experience, we provide, reasonable baselines that will work in the majority of cases. And actually, as of 2.0, you don't need to specify anything about the pipeline or the components that you want to use. We'll just pick something reasonable for you by default. But if you are a machine learning engineer and you want to add a lot of custom functionality, because we're open source, because we have a sort of like modular component system, you can build like your own tokenizer. You can build, your own NLU. You can build your own NER and sort of customize and modify any of the machine learning components or any of the things that you use to serve your dialogue. So yes, we do use machine learning. You do not need to know machine learning to use Rasa. And a question from Nishant. I'm trying to build an insurance claims bot, also trying to use Guidewire integration. I'm so fairly new. Could you please share some suggestions? Thanks a lot. Guidewire is.
Neither do I. I'm looking at it right now. So, software company in San Mateo, California.
Okay, so it's like an existing component you're trying to.
Platform for property and casualty insurance carriers. Don't know what that is.
So if you're trying to integrate with something, probably the easiest way to do it. So the custom connectors that we talked about, back to them, are for like an interface, right? So it's a place where somebody will say something that will be sent to the assistant. The assistant will, use NLU to convert that text into something machine readable. It'll pick what to say next using the dialogue policy, and then it'll say something back. So that's what the connectors are for. If you want during that process to like refer to another API or to execute some code, I would probably do that using what's called a custom action. Let me pull up the action servers. There we go. So we have a Python SDK. So sorry, I keep dropping my mouse. That's what that sound is. I have a little sloping mouse rest, and if it's not on it just so, it falls onto the ground. Listen, it works for my wrists. So it's very easy to run any, sort of, I shouldn't say very easy. If you're a Python developer, it's fairly straightforward to use the Python SDK to write any Python code you need to trigger, and then you'd have a custom action, and you'd provide training examples where, okay, someone's providing a bunch of information, and then I want to trigger this custom action that maybe goes to this API for an external service with all this information, with maybe authentication. gets the information, brings it back, I store it, and then give it to my user in a conversational way. If you don't know Python, we do have our Rasa API, and then also the Actions API. So the Rasa server is running all the conversation bits. The Action server is running any action code that you happen to have. You don't need an Action server, and you can, create anything you want in any programming language. The more it's not Python, the more work it's going to be, but it's very flexible. So that would be my sort of general approach there. And I think we have an insurance example. No?
We do. I don't think it's either super new that I don't know about it, or it's older and I'm not remembering it. We have the big ones we have as a financial demo, IT help desk. I don't know like what they're exactly building within the insurance space, but if it's more of an IT help desk, then there is one. If the addition I would add to Rachel's while she's kind of looking would be always plugging for conversation-driven development. CDD is kind of a way to really get started, right? So once you've kind of figured out, are you integrating via channel or kind of just custom action, depending on the nature of how you integrate. I would say building what we call a minimum viable assistant, which maybe covers, like, say, the 5 happy paths that you're pretty aware that your assistant will cover. Adding a little bit of NLU training data, and then actually deploying your assistant, ideally, in my opinion, with Rasa X, and then sharing your assistant as soon as possible, right? As soon as you have that minimum viable assistant, and start getting feedback from people. What are they trying to do that you didn't anticipate, or the unhappy paths that they followed, and then using all of their messages as training data, and kind of over time getting to a
yeah. And I often get asked, just to build on Tyler's point, how do you know if you're, like, how do you measure how well a conversational AI is working, how well a chatbot is working? And of course, you can have metrics that are like X number of people, successfully file their bite claims, or you can look at the conversations and tell how people are getting along, which is there's no way that you're not going to be able to look at language data. I think this is the one I was talking about. I don't think the code is available, but there is sort of a case study that talks about what they did. So I think this might be a good jumping off point for you. All right. George says, how do you deal with the continuous integration and unit/integration testing of TensorFlow models? If you're using Rasa X, the models are versioned, along with everything else. Every time you train a model, it's saved separately, and you can choose which model you're using at any point in production. Testing of TensorFlow models. So usually what we do is we have a test that's like a conversation that we know how we want it to go. And when you change something in your pipeline or train a new model, you would rerun that test and be like, yes, conversation went the way I expected it to go. My NLU identified my intents within, sort of machine learning. It's stochastic. There's going to be a little bit of wiggle room, but like 98% of my intents or whatever is sort of the general process I would use there. Do you have any other?
That seems about what I would say. It's kind of the input-output testing is the big one, I would say, is also just talking to it yourself, maybe. Or having users talk to it and seeing how well it does, right? Maybe it's not as rigorous as doing some actual testing, but just for your sanity and even just to make sure, kind of reviewing conversations, is that human in the loop, I think, is super important to getting a really good assistant.
Yeah, definitely agree. And I would say definitely test users before like real customers. Yeah. You keep some training wheels on at first.
Even when you get to real customers, I usually recommend start with a beta group or with 1,000 at first, if you then keep kind of concentric circles expanding, but wouldn't recommend going to everyone at once.
Sridhar says, I started my Rasa journey recently. Welcome to the Rasa Club. If I have a website and want to integrate with a Rasa chatbot, do I use a front-end JavaScript?
So the best place for this, I would say, is the channel on the Rasa open source docs. And there is a channel called Your Own Website, I think, or something like that. I don't know if that's the name of the channel, but at least in the docs it was that. Yep. So then at the
Yeah, your own website. There we go.
And so there's actually a couple open source, or maybe it's just one now. Widgets, like JavaScript widgets you can use to add to your website. So I think chat room is one that's decently used and maintained. But effectively, this actual your own website, I think it's either the REST input channel or socket.io. And I mean, both are you could use pretty easily, especially the REST channel, right, with your website.
I have a little mini example tutorial that goes through where the Rasa goes with the chat room widget and how to point to endpoints on the channel. I think it's I was using Django, so I think it's Rasa Assistant Django website connecting. I don't remember the title. It's in the tutorials playlist, so hopefully that'll help give you a little off point. Question. Hopefully that helped. Cube says, one more question. Can I use RasaBot or any of its conversational services in my front? Oh, two front-end questions back to back. In my front end, like React JavaScript or Flask deploy it as a web API. Also, does it integrate with front ends easily? I will say, just an FYI, we don't build a front end except as part of Rasa X. You want to talk about that, Tyler?
Yeah. Even for Rasa X, for example, right? Like if you're going to be using any channel that isn't just the one test channel that we have, or in Rasa X, you can also not only share like a link with test users and have them interface there, you can also talk to the assistant yourself and talk to your bot section. Those are the only two kind of UIs that we maintain and support for being able to talk to your assistant. And so Rasa X, right, the vast majority of your conversations are probably not going to come from there. They're going to come from connecting to Twilio or Slack or Telegram. And I guess in those cases, you don't have to build a UI either, but if you're somewhere in between, like you want it on your own website, then using something like that room would probably be your best bet.
I think that's part of what we say when we mean when we say infrastructure layer is that like we don't own the servers, we don't like create the front end, we're like just handling the conversation part of it, which means you can use any backend, you can use any front end, and it's very flexible. So, and yes, you absolutely can use Flask or React or whatever your preferred way of creating front ends is. Well, I think I've only ever used Flask to make APIs. I don't think I've ever used it to make a front end. I'm also not a front end person. So Akib says, I'm asking, so in regards to the website thing, I'm asking because I'm working on something like this. Yeah, I would recommend checking this out. Ooh, this is a good question. Sachin says, how do we know in Rasa if our machine learning model is overfitting or not? Yeah. So we do have, I don't have an environment pulled up right here, but we do have some visualizations that you can create from your trained models. And I believe it's in the CLI. Visualize just represents sort of like the different paths for the stories that you've provided.
It's in test. Yeah. If we scroll down to, I was actually looking at this today because I was doing a product onboarding for people joining the Rasa team, and they asked me, can you specify the number of cross-validation folds? And I was like, yeah, I think you can. So I dug through here to find it. I think it won't be like in the command line interface, but I think if you click like evaluating an NLU model or a core model, it'll be in that area. I could be wrong about it.
Oh, and also test doesn't test the custom actions, FYI. You want to do your
That's
own.
on the roadmap as well. At least the option to turn it on and off, right? Like if you do want to. I guess while Rachel's kind of looking, I would say maybe a test set would be, and Rasa test NLU is natively supports it. So like creating a test set of conversations, right, or a test set of messages would be very helpful for you to be able to run it on and make sure that that your model is really good at generalizing to that test set it hasn't seen. Limited knowledge of overfitting, I think that would be a place I would start.
Yeah, and I
believe
believe
the wrong way, Rachel. I'm sorry.
Oh no, it's fine. Trying to find it here, but I believe it has in-fold and out-of-fold validation scores. I have seen them at some point in the past, and I would dig in here a little bit more. And also, like, more practically, you want your model to be able to generalize to new types of conversations, right? And it's hard to know, just as, you know, a developer, you're working, you're typing, what sort of things people who are actually using your assistant is going to do. So I would say you're absolutely do your model validation, do your verification, dig into your stats as well. But what's going to be a more useful way of evaluating your model is to get it in front of test users and seeing how it works for them, because they will surprise you and they will say things that you did not think that they were going to say, and they're not going to say things that you did think that they were going to say. And yes, on the machine learning side of it, there's that, but I would also say on just sort of like the user side of it, getting it in front of people as soon as possible, and then annotating the real user data, folding it into your model, retraining. Again, we do model versioning automatically, so you don't have to worry about losing your older models. Is going to be the best way to build a robust system. There's a machine learning answer, and then there's the practical.
Really good point though, because at the end of the day, like what really matters is what end user experience you provide. Right? And I think overfitting could be one of actually many different ways you might not deliver that ultimate great experience. And so you spend too much time on just the overfitting problem, then you might not necessarily build a great process.
So that's my answer there. Habib, does Rasa support static typing? In custom actions, yes. This is sort of my answer. Yep.
That's about the only place you're writing Python code, right? So code in general with Rasa, I would say.
If you're asking whether like the code for the internals is static typed, yeah. Let's go look at the code. Let's pull something up. Do that in another window. Meanwhile, Sachin says, how do we deal with a large data set to train if we don't have a GPU?
I don't know what large necessarily means, but you should be able to train most assistants with CPUs. Kind of as Rachel was saying earlier, like it's a pretty big assistant that I don't even know if I've heard of an assistant. I think that wouldn't be possible like to train with a CPU. Generally, the issue people run into is it can take a long time. I've heard some people moving into that over an hour, over 90 minutes, and that becomes a long time to wait, especially if you're following conversation-driven development and constantly improving your model. It's hard. It kind of slows down your iterations. And so if you don't have a GPU, how could you maybe speed it up? Potentially using some of the cloud providers, they offer some level of GPU access. So I've heard some users, I can't speak to how well it works or doesn't work, but I've heard some users report like using AWS SageMaker more recently as kind of a route of speeding up their model times. But like I said, I haven't tried it myself.
Yeah. I would also say that from my experience working with different people who are working on Rasa projects, the main reason why training is slow is that you have more intents that you need. So a very common pattern that I see, which completely reasonable, I think, is that let's say you have somebody and they're trying to schedule a trip and you want them to be able to schedule a boat ride, a train ride, a plane ride, a taxi, and you create a separate intent for all of those. So like schedule taxi, schedule train ride, schedule plane. Whereas my recommendation for something like that would be to have a scheduling intent and then use entities to detect whether they're trying to schedule, plane, which way that they're trying to travel. And the reason for that is that when you have more classes, it is harder to train your model and it's going to take longer to converge. And you can just, imagine this if you're like a human taking a multiple choice quest. It's easier and faster to take a multiple choice test if you have 3 choices per question than if you have 28 choices per question. So if you can rejigger your assistant a little bit to have fewer intents, oftentimes that will speed up your training. And also if you have fewer intents, then you generally need fewer examples. And that will also often speed up training. Obviously not always going to be doable in all situations, but that's just sort of my general recommendation. And then Peter suggests getting a GPU or using cloud services. Akib says you can use Kaggle kernels or Colab, which are both hosted Jupyter notebooks. You could definitely do that. There are resources. But and I don't know if I mentioned this when we were talking about TensorFlow, but sort of one of the doses things that the Rasa team wants to do is to have our machine learning code to be very lightweight, so it doesn't take resources to.
And something actually just pops to mind too as well is when we were actually looking earlier on the configuring TensorFlow, there's actually an optimizing CPU performance for TensorFlow as well. I haven't done it myself, but I imagine that might be a way to speed things up. And then also, I'm not sure exactly on this one, but maybe playing around with the hyperparameters a bit too. So decrease the number of epochs. The problem with that is you might not converge on models. So I wouldn't recommend that as a first attempt, but if you're like really trying to decrease the time, then maybe looking into that as well.
Or early stopping might also be.
Yeah.
And you should be able to do that in the TensorFlow configuration. Also, to answer the static typing question, yes. And I vaguely remembered it being in sort of like our style recommendations, but and this, if you are curious, is from one of our NLU featureizers, and it's an n-gram featureizer. I just picked a random. All right, so it is almost exactly 10 a.m. for me, significantly later than that for Tyler. So before we round up, finish, I was like, that doesn't sound right. That sounds like the wrong thing. If you had one piece of advice or recommendation for someone working on, let's say, a Rasa assistant for the first time, what would it be?
It's kind of cliche. We've said it many, many times over and over again, but getting your assistant in the hands of users, or at the very least test users, even if it's just your friends or family or colleagues or anyone else, send me an email. Like, I will play with your assistant, right? Just to get you your training data that you need and to get you the feedback you need. Like, I think it really makes a difference in terms of what assistant you're able to build. Are you actually solving the problem you set out to? What experience are you delivering? And the longer you wait, in my opinion, the more you're probably investing in a suboptimal approach, right? You're probably building things and giving attention to problems that aren't as big as what you're really going to face when you actually give it to people in the real world. And number of developers that I've seen that didn't necessarily heed that advice, or I mean, started before I gave that advice, or Rasa was around to give that advice, that have kind of tried to put an assistant out there after months and months of kind of locking themselves in a room. It just generally doesn't work, and so you're kind of almost, I like to say, guaranteed to fail. So it's almost better to fail early, right, and fail with people who are a bit friendly to you failing, and then kind of get that process over a little bit earlier. Use it to actually improve and use it to be more efficient with your time, right? To make sure you're working on the most important things. I think is an underrated fact, right? Not only are you going to build a better model, say with training data that comes from real messages, but you're also going to focus on the important things that are important to your users, which is the main reason you decided to build a conversational interface. And I guess in summary, share your assistant with users early would be my one piece of advice.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent piece of advice, and I would also love for people to build things that work and not have a frustrating experience either as users or developers. All right, thank you so much for joining today, Tyler. I had a lot of fun. I hope everyone watching also had fun. If you have additional questions, you can ask them on the Rasa forum, forum.rasa.com. We try to get to them relatively quickly. It varies depending on what other stuff is going on and how many community members are active at any particular time. But if you have other questions, community forum is a great place to ask them. I hope you have a lot of fun building assistants. Thank you for joining, Tyler. On the programming note, tomorrow we will have a paper reading group. We're reading a paper about sort of like a way to generate chatbot responses that's like a fusion of neural language models and templates, which is, I don't know, it's interesting. It's an interesting paper. And then on Friday, we're going to be working on live coding, and I'm working on a way to tell users that something that they've asked the assistant to do is out of scope, so the assistant can't do it yet, and how we handle that, in Rasa 2.0. So love to see you on Thursday or Friday or next Wednesday for more office hours. Thanks for joining, Tyler. Thanks for joining, everybody, and I'll talk to y'all.